Gitta Sereny has made a career exploring the minds of people who commit unfathomable atrocities. She continues her probe with her current work, Albert Speer, His Battle with Truth. The second most powerful man in the Third Reich and widely regarded as Hitler's favorite, Albert Speer was the only Nazi leader to accept collective responsibility at the Nuremberg trials. But his struggle to come to terms with individual guilt persisted until his death at age 76 in 1986. I'm pleased to have Gitta here to talk about this book, this man, and the ideas that are so fascinating to her and to all of us. Welcome. It's great to see you again. Tell me the ideas that you have done that brought you to Albert Speer, who you first saw at the Nuremberg trials, and you first came into your, in a sense, to your cognizance. But you have been involved with the ideas of individual responsibility. You've also been involved with how good people can do, good people and gifted people, intelligent people, can come to such awful, awful atrocities, and having to do with Nazis and concentration camps, and also having to do with children. Having said that, tell me what brought you to Albert Speer.
Well, I think you're right, just as you said, and it's all connected, you know.
Yes.
I'm very interested in disturbed children, so I wrote a great deal about children who kill. And then I became extremely interested in the worst part of the Nazi time, the extermination of the Jews. So I did a book called Into That Darkness, which was about the commandant of Treblinka. And I spent a long time with him in prison, talking to him, Stanger, Franz Stanger. And, well, then Speer really came into my life quite a lot later, in 1977. And he approached me, not I him. I didn't really want to see Speer. I liked his books. I was very interested in his books, Inside the Third Reich and the Spandau Secret Diaries, but I didn't like the looks of him. I saw him on TV, and he seemed to me too, I don't know, too smooth, you know. And I didn't like his consistent mea culpas. I didn't believe them. So I didn't really want to see him. And then he contacted me.
And why did he contact you?
Well, he had read Into That Darkness, which I gather moved him. And he had read an expose I did with a colleague, Lou Chester from the Sunday Times in London, on David Irving, whose lies are exposed, or we exposed. But I think it goes further than that. I think Speer was looking. He was looking for someone he could talk to. He talked, of course, to hundreds of people, you know, since he was released from Spandau. Let's face it, he gave hundreds of interviews. But he could never say this thing which was weighing so heavily upon him, which was his personal guilt. He had tried 3 times before me, tried 3 people. One was a French pastor at Spandau. He was a wonderful man, Georges Cassalis. Then a Jewish rabbi, another wonderful man, Abba Geis. And finally a Catholic priest, Pater Athanasius.
And why did it fail with them?
Well, it failed with them because I think that they had they developed very definite views on how he should deal with his life. This is different from me, finally, you see. My view, not my view, but my feeling about whether it is Speer or, and there is no comparison, you know, between Speer and the commandant of Treblinka, Stanger, or Stangl, or whoever, is that if there is a heavy load of guilt, it is not just for their good, but really for our all good, if they can somehow admit it. Now, you can ask why this is so, and I would find it difficult to answer that question. I'm coming ahead of you.
I want to interrupt you now and just make several points that I think are important. One is that Albert, you say it's. I've always said Speer, and it's Speer and Speer.
Yeah.
Architect from what city in Germany?
Well, from Heidelberg, really.
No.
Mannheim and Heidelberg. Yeah.
His father was an architect.
His father was an architect, yes.
He came to the attention of the Nazis, and he did the headquarters first, the headquarters square of the Nazi...
the Nazi Party, that's
in
the first
30s,
thing he
in
did
the 30s.
in the early 30s, I mean 1930 actually.
Yeah. And then...
1933.
And then Goebbels asked him to do...
Then he was asked to do the inside of Goering's new building.
Was this Goebbels or Goering?
No, Goebbels. Did I say Goering?
You said Goering. It was
I beg
Goebbels,
pardon,
yeah.
I meant Goebbels.
Right.
Later, Goering asked him to do his house, but that's different. Anyway, Goebbels.
And so he came to the attention of Hitler.
It came to the attention of Hitler because he did it so quickly. Not because he did it so beautifully, but because he did it so quickly. And so Hitler vaguely heard of him. But Hitler didn't really give any, he didn't really show any interest in him at all until suddenly, one day, he was showing, actually he was sort of walking behind Hitler while Hitler was being shown around a building site. And Speer was just there. He wasn't really supposed to be seen. He was only 28 years old. I mean, you know, he was 27.
Yes.
And suddenly Hitler turned to him and said, come and have lunch. And Speer told me he nearly dropped dead. Come and have lunch? Hitler asked him to lunch. And he had a dirty sleeve. And so he looked at his sleeve, and Hitler said, oh, don't worry about that, we'll fix that. And he took him upstairs to his residence and took him to his bedroom and called the valet and said, bring my blue jacket. And so that was Hitler's dress coat. And he said, put that on. And so he puts on Hitler's dress coat. And he said he honestly thought he was going to faint. I mean, here he was with the man he admired most in the whole world. But I mean, we must come to that. Why did he admire him?
Trust me, I understand where to go.
I know, I trust you. The man he admired most in the whole world, and he put his dress coat on him, which was a very odd thing. I mean, it was in a way, it was rather a physical thing, wasn't it? And this, because, you know, neither of these men were homosexuals, but
but they were attracted to each other for different reasons.
Yeah, they were enormously attracted to each other.
And what were those reasons?
Well,
as the relationship
I mean,
grew?
This is, of course, my own interpretation. Some of it is Speer's, but some of it is mine. I mean, Speer, of course, grew to, if you like, love Hitler, partly because of this enormous hero worship and romantic worship and so on. Partly, no doubt, there was the element of power. You know, Hitler was so unbelievably powerful. Partly because Hitler was going to make him into Germany's greatest architect.
If not the best-known architect in the world.
Probably. And you have to remember with this that Speer never thought that he was a good architect.
And his father was a mediocre architect.
His father was, yes, not a great architect. But above all, Speer thought he was not a good architect, and Hitler was going to... Now, what did Hitler feel about Speer? That's what's so interesting.
What did Hitler feel?
Well, Hitler, about Speer, I believe, saw in him a kind of ideal. Which is a funny thing. You know, here was Hitler.
Because he was handsome and charming.
Well, yes, and he was German. Hitler, you see, was an Austrian, working-class Austrian, spoke very sort of an Austrian accent and so on. And here was this upper-class German, handsome, intelligent, beautifully brought up, and speaking this wonderful German, and an architect in the bargain.
And Hitler once wanted to be a painter.
Hitler once wanted to be a painter and then an architect. And so here was his ideal, in a way. I think that Speer came as close to seeming Hitler's son to him.
How do you know that? And how do you know that Hitler admired Speer that much, other than Speer telling you?
No, you see, this book is not... Speer goes through it, you know, like a lifeline. But this book is about 52 people. And of these 52 people, about 15 lived with Hitler and around Hitler. So in the course of researching this book for 8 years, I found out more about Hitler, and of course also from Speer, mainly from Speer, than I had ever hoped to.
What did you find out that was most interesting, and what were you most curious about?
Yes. Well, there are two things that I mainly found out about Hitler. Mm-hmm. I found out that Hitler had an extraordinary way of protecting the people around him. Now, this has not been previously written, you know, it's new, as I'm told by my historian friends who have written on Hitler. He was absolutely determined that the people he so desperately needed, his own small circle, who were always with him, who were always around him, that they would never hear about anything that was bad.
That brings us to the central question of this. What did Albert Speer know, and how much guilt did he have about that, and how has he dealt with that guilt? And that's what I want to turn to.
His responsibility was certainly not for the murder of the Jews, except in a moral sense. In an actual sense, he had nothing to do with it. In a moral sense, he was responsible, as all of them were, for everything that happened. His direct responsibility was, as I put to him many times in this book, as you will see, was the death of literally hundred thousands of his slave workers, 14 million of them he was responsible for.
Because he was the Minister of Armaments, and he was responsible for all those slave laborers who came to make the bombs that the Nazi war machine used.
Yes, he was somebody else, of course, under him, if you like, who was in fact hanged.
His subordinate was hanged.
His subordinate was hanged, but he was not.
And he got away because he accepted collective guilt. He said, I accept the responsibility.
Collective responsibility, not collective guilt.
Collective responsibility.
Yes, he did.
For the crimes of Hitler, but he never acknowledged his specific crimes, and you think he's been struggling with that.
I think he's been struggling with only one thing. He did not struggle with his responsibility, as I've just said, and his responsibility for the death of the slave laborers. And he told me in so many words several times, and all of it is in the book, every time we talked about it, that he did not feel guilty about this. And I said, well, how could you not feel guilty about it? You know what happened to them. You know how they were treated. And he said that was in the course of war. He made a distinct difference between what happened in the course of war, not as a result of, but in the course of war, and what he came to believe happened outside war. It had nothing to do with war. The death of the Jews, excuse me, the death of the Jews had nothing to do with war.
He was at that meeting in which Himmler made that speech, in which Himmler, in fact, addressed Speer, among others, and took note of his name, in which he said, the Fuhrer wants to exterminate the Jews. When you forced him to deal with that.
Yes, he didn't actually say the Fuhrer. I mean, I wish he had, but he didn't say that. But he did, and we cannot be absolutely certain that Speer was actually in the hall when these words were pronounced. Speer has always claimed, including to me, that he was not there. I spent 6 months only on the investigation of that particular point.
And your judgment is he was in the hall or not in the hall?
My judgment is that we cannot know. You know, one has to simply look these things in the face. And we cannot absolutely, but it doesn't make any difference whether he was there or not. From there, whether in that afternoon or the next morning, doesn't matter, he went to Hitler's headquarters. So did all these political leaders who were at this meeting. They went to Hitler's headquarters. And at Hitler's headquarters, Speer had 3 meals with these men and Hitler. And then the very, very important night tea, which was Hitler's very special meeting with his close circle. all women were excluded that night. They were always there from that circle. And his closest aide, Nicholas von Bellow, was excluded that night from that circle. And Speer was there with 8 of these men. Now, it is totally impossible that conference and what was said at that conference was not mentioned. It is impossible.
And when you said it just that way to Albert Speer, what did he say?
He said, "You cannot believe me, but it is true." He was lying, you see, but now, can I just say this? He was lying, but it is one thing which I think perhaps almost no one could tell the truth about. It is really almost impossible. You know, Speer's daughter, Hilde, who is a wonderful woman, said to me, after Speer died, I said, "All right, tell me, do you think he knew about the Jews?" And she said, "Of course he knew about it."
His daughter.
"Of course he knew," she said, "but what do all of you want? What do you want from him? How can a man admit that? If he admits that, he must die." And I believe that is true. Now, Speer did get to a point after 3 weeks with me of very, very intense conversations, of admitting some of this, but some of this knowledge.
He admitted that he knew the Jews were being sent, quote, east, but he did not know...
No, he admitted more than that. He admitted more than that. He showed me an affidavit which he had written, and he said, "I will show you this, read it, and let us never mention the subject again." And in this affidavit, at the end of it, he said, this affidavit was written for the South African Board of Deputies of Jews. And he said at the end, "My greatest sorrow is that I tacitly assented to the murder of millions of Jews."
Let me make one note to our audience this evening, is that we're going to do a 2-part conversation with you, and part of it will be tonight, and the second part will be later this week. Having made that note, I want to continue this conversation for the next 3 minutes and come to one issue of controversy about not Albert Speer, but about you. And it is the following. You've come to the fact that the two of you, in a sense, grew together, and you grew to say, "I liked him." And people say, how could she ever say that? How could she deal with this monster and have those words come out of her? Okay. Tell me what you say to those who find liking Albert Speer abhorrent.
I started the book with the words, "I knew Albert Speer very well, and I grew to like him." That's different.
That's what I said, grew to like him.
Yes, I grew to like him. And I grew to like him because what I grew to like was not Speer, the personality. I grew to like his guilt. I grew to believe in his very, very real sense of guilt. And that I grew to like him.
You grew to like the fact that he anguished over his individual guilt and his individual sins and his individual illegalities.
Yes, I really grew to like that very much indeed. That he fought so hard with that he found it so desperately torturing. And really died with this, finally.
But he lied about it.
Because you cannot not lie about it. You see, the fact is that what was done. I mean, Hitler did, you know, countless terrible things, much worse, really, than people nowadays admit or realize or remember. I mean, he had countless millions killed, not, in quotes, only Jews, but countless millions of Christians, Slavs, Poles. But what is heaviest in the conscience of the world is the death of the Jews in the gas chambers. That is what we really identify with Hitler. Wrongly, in a way, because, as I just said, so many other things happened. But Speer, too, came to believe that that was the only and worst thing, and that he could not live with. And he could not live with pronouncing that guilt.
The Holocaust.
Yes, well, the murder of the Jews, he could not do it.
We will continue a conversation about Hitler, Speer, and with Gitta Sereny in a later broadcast. We'll be right back. Stay with us. I want to continue this conversation with the notion of Hitler and what you learned about him, and how was this man able to achieve what he did? How did he come, in your view and in the view of Speer, to wreak such awful, awful deeds onto the world and onto so many innocent people? What was it about Hitler and how much of that was attractive to Speer?
I think that it's a marvelous question, by the way, because you know, he remains actually the great puzzle, Hitler, for all of us. Don't you think it's extraordinary that 50 years later I'm able to write this book? It is bought already by thousands of people in Europe, young people, who are saying, my God, at last we are hearing what actually people felt about him, about Hitler. It is Hitler they really want to know about. And why? Because somehow he has put into the world, you know, an evil which really did not exist before. I mean, God knows Stalin did absolutely terrible things,
and killed millions of people.
And killed millions of people. But somehow Hitler was the personification of evil somehow. And I, who believe, and I do believe, and I say so in my other books about children, I who believe that all children are born good, I have to really question my own feelings when I look at Hitler.
So then how does one, oh, you do. So Hitler may have been born evil.
There is something inexplicable about Hitler's evil. And he did something, you know, which has never been done in the history of the world, which is that he made a good, a decent, and one of the most cultured nations in the world believe that bad was good. You know, that is a very, very big thing, if you think about it. He ordered murder. But, you know, you say that like that. And everybody who hears me say this, or who would hear you say that, will say, oh, yes, the Jews. But you see, he didn't. He started out by ordering murder in Poland and in Russia of thousands and thousands of political personalities, of educated people, of artists, of musicians, of anyone in Poland and in Russia and the Ukraine and so on, who would have continued to be or to create an elite in these countries. He was, forget for one moment about the Jews, he was absolutely determined to diminish these countries, these huge and great countries, into a slave population forever. That is what they would have been if Germany had won the war.
Why did he want to do that?
Well, that is why I say that Hitler is the great puzzle. Hitler's absolutely unbelievable evil. Because he felt, I mean, I'm saying this, giving a reason for this is so impossible, but I will try. He felt that only one, quote, race had the right to live a superior life, and everyone else was to live below them. And this was, of course, the Germanic race.
But you find some, you also make the point about Hitler that the early Hitler was not nearly as bad.
No, I don't, yes, I don't make the point that way. I mean, I explain.
It's not
why,
as extreme. There's not what?
I explain, yes, I do explain why the Germans, in the beginning, for a long time, accepted Hitler. And, you know, it wasn't only the Germans. You must remember that Hitler was accepted as a kind of savior by British personalities, by American personalities, by French personalities. Everybody, in fact, Churchill said, I hope that if we need it one day, we have a man like this. Can you believe it? But this is what actually happened. And at the time, really, his appalling plans were not clear to anyone. Speer said to me, you know, if Hitler had said in the first meeting, for instance, that Speer attended where Hitler spoke, where he appeared, incidentally, in a dark blue suit, speaking like a professor to the students and teachers who were assembled there. He said if he had said to us that his plan was to kill millions of people and kill millions of Jews, why, that would have been the end of him. But he didn't. He spoke very sensibly about the need for Germany to regain faith in herself, about the need of Germans to live in friendship with each other and other people. Everything made sense.
He spoke to German pride, is what he did.
He spoke to German pride.
That had been extinguished by World War I and difficult economic times and the suffering of the people.
Yes, and
but dictators do that. I mean,
dictators do that,
technique of dictators.
True, and he also gave them work immediately.
What I find troubling, and I want to give you a chance to tell me if this is in fact, you seem to be saying that the ultimate atrocities of the extermination of the Jews was not the worst sin, not the worst crime, not the thing that we ought to hold Hitler most responsible for and indict the Nazis most for?
No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
I really think that the extermination of the Jews, the factory killing of the Jews, was the worst thing that he did or that was ever done in history. I am saying...
Go ahead.
Sorry. No, what I am saying is that we need to rebalance a certain historical unbalance that has come about, or imbalance, which speaks of Hitler as only the death of the Jews.
So you want to say, let's recognize additional sins.
Let us recognize that he did far more than this, and that his plans...
That it wasn't comparable, but it was...
It was not comparable
additional.
in kind.
Okay. Let me come back to Speer. In the end, he died when he was 76 years old in 1986 after an interview.
He died in
1981, sorry.
Yes.
In the end, he had come to what as a result of the conversations with you and his battle with truth?
Well, I think perhaps we should speak before the end, because actually, as you will see in the book, I mean, he actually returned upon himself in not a very good way in the last few months of his life. But before that, he had reached a point where I think he was about as ready to pronounce this guilt as he could have been. And he was also ready to lead a very quiet life for his future years, which he believed he had, writing and thinking, I won't say praying, because he was not religious in that sense, but really pondering about what had happened. What I'm really trying to say with this is that, you know, Speer knew more about that period of our history, I mean the history of our century, I think, than anyone else.
Who survived that period.
Who survived that period. And he knew more about Hitler than anyone else.
Because he had more access.
He had more, yes, but more access, but he also had more, he gained more understanding, especially in retrospect.
Then I ask you one more time, what do we know because of his insights and because he was there?
We know, I tell you what we know. We know that Hitler, as well as Speer, as well as all human beings, have many levels up, Every personality is made of many levels. One cannot look at people, including Hitler, as only black and white. If one does, one gets nothing. People, you know, there is a grayness, an in-between level in people. And to seek that out is really to find the secret, if you like, of people's personality.
Have you ever been able to answer finally this question of what makes people evil, other than family, other than, I mean,
if I tell you, you will get hundreds of telephone calls. I think what creates evil is emotion. Every single person I have talked to over the last 35 years on this subject, not on the subject of Nazis, but on the subject of evil of one kind or another, has been brought to this, or has been driven to it, as children are, by emotion, by love, or by the withdrawal of love. I know this sounds very feminine, you know, and perhaps I know all this, and I know this is what many people will say, and they say, oh, this isn't serious. But you know, our lives, that is what our lives are. Our lives are emotion. And if we don't have emotion, we are nothing, you know? If we don't have, next to emotion, morality, we're also nothing. Speer, I say it in the book, through this corruption he suffered because of his love for Hitler and Hitler's love for him, became not immoral nor amoral, but morality was extinguished in him. And if morality is extinguished, there is no human being left.
And he may have known that.
I think he knew that, and I think he came back.
Came back?
Came back. I think he recovered some morality.
Albert Speer, his battle with truth. Gitta, thank you very much for joining us. We thank you for joining us. Look forward to seeing you tomorrow night.